Hello, so here we are again, and today we are going to delve into the perhaps unexplored world of classical tenor saxophone mouthpiece setups. And to deal with this subject, we've got the expert here, Aiden, who you may have recognized from previous videos, well, I think a previous video anyway, where he was a superstar. And he's going to help me out today because I'm not so much an authority when it comes to classical tenor sax playing. So I'm really grateful to you to come and help us out today. So thanks, Aiden.
No worries.
And I think what we're going to try and focus on here is the fact that we perhaps should treat the tenor differently to the way we would treat an alto, the way we think of alto when it comes to classical playing, as we discussed last week when we suddenly had the brainwave to do this as a video. So we're going to take it from the point of view of the mouthpiece setup, and perhaps with the idea that we think of all of these classic mouthpiece setups for alto saxophone, those classic brands of Selmer, Van Doren, and all the rest of it. But it might be a different scenario with tenor, so to be discussed.
Yes.
And then also perhaps looking at the topic of the tip opening, how that could be different and influence the result, or perhaps take us in the direction that might be optimal for tenor sax playing.
Possibly, yeah.
Okay, so that's the intro. So with that said, maybe let's just explore what are the challenges that the classical tenor sax player faces in terms of, you know, the repertoire that we play as a classical tenor player.
So the tenor's a really interesting voice in the saxophone world. Obviously, in rock and pop and jazz, it's got a very, established role, principally as a solo or a frontline instrument. What you find with classical tenor is that it's sort of assigned lots of different roles. It has to do lots of different things, some of which don't necessarily suit the instrument terribly well if we play it in the way that we might play a soprano or an alto saxophone. So some of the main things are, in a saxophone quartet, you're often called to be a middle voice that blends very well between the baritone and the alto. So you need to be able to play with a darker sound. But on the opposite side of the spectrum, in a classical saxophone quartet, you might have everyone else playing an accompanying part, and the tenor sax has a solo line that needs to cut through, even though it's in a range that really sort of doesn't suit cutting through the rest of the sounds around it. And equally in orchestral repertoire, there's also the challenge. I think a lot of people think of the saxophone as being a very loud instrument, which it is, but when you're in an orchestral setting, you've also got to consider that you're possibly playing with up to 60 or maybe even 80 other players. And so a lot of people find that on some mouthpieces, you take them to an orchestral setting and suddenly you feel a little bit undergunned. And the other thing, there are a few sort of specific things. Articulation in the low register could be quite challenging, and particularly in quartet repertoire and some orchestral repertoire, the tenor is called on to do some sort of faster articulation in that area. And then you've also got the age-old problem of what happens over the break when you go from the C natural or the C sharp to the full tube D. So that's some of the things
tonal change.
The tonal change,
can just stand out a mile if you get it wrong, can't it?
Yes, yeah. So there's lots to discuss there.
There's a lot to get into. I mean, perhaps it'd be nice just to start by hearing some sounds, and maybe, I don't know what you've got set up on your tenor sax there. Is that your standard go-to setup to kick things off?
This one isn't really. I can change that.
Okay.
This one I think is a Selmer soloist in a D.
Right.
And it's one of a range that we've got here today, which...
Sure. Well, shall we start off by demonstrating a piece that you feel most comfortable with, or an excerpt?
Yeah, of course.
I think I can see Bolero on the page there.
Yes.
Would that be a good place to start?
Absolutely fine, yes.
Yeah, and we can maybe hear from the point of view of how the solo should sound. So, well, let's just get familiar with the sound of the piece for a start.
Of course.
But maybe start from the point of view of, this is maybe what would be considered a typical classical tenor sax sound, if there is such a thing, and then we
Yeah.
can discuss that afterwards.
Of course.
Okay, so we'll crack into that now. So you're going to do it on the soloist.
I think what I'll do is I will actually change to a C star.
Yes, Aiden. I really like that. It sounds great. It's like such a different world from the world I normally explore when I'm playing tenor, and especially to hear it close up as well, the control that you sort of exercise on the instrument. I love it. Anyway, back to the topic in hand.
Of course.
So that's you playing the Selmer S80 C star.
Exactly, yes.
And the reed.
The reed there is a Van Doren 2.5, blue box traditional.
So maybe I'll explain from my point of view how it sounds, and then you can tell me maybe some of the challenges that you're sort of experiencing there. I mean, to me it sounds great. It sounds really well controlled. It's got that nice dark covered sound that I always imagine in my head when I think of a good classical saxophone sound. Forget tenor, but just saxophone sound, classical saxophone sound in general. So it sounds great. I almost felt like I should have done the snare ostinato there, but I would have got it out of time and people would have commented negatively. So anyway, it sounded great. So what are the challenges that you sort of were experiencing with that setup?
Yeah, so to be honest, Bolero is actually a very forgiving excerpt because it's a solo tenor line. There's really not much else going on. As you say, there's this snare accompaniment. So with this particular solo, you've actually got some scope to play on something like a narrower tip opening, which we will speak about.
Yeah.
Some of the challenges I find, particularly with narrower tip openings, is you get a very, very nice covered sound. It's very focused, it's got a real dark core to it.
Yeah.
But there are a few moments where the differences between the registers really stand out. I do find on a narrow tip opening, the C to the D over the break in the Bolero. It does stick out a little bit. I don't know if that's coming up on the microphone. And it feels very much like you get to that full tube D, and it feels like that's the one sound it can do. Whereas with a mouthpiece that's slightly wider, you can find there's a little bit more flexibility there. And I find even though you lose some of that darkness and roundness of the sound, you gain consistency across that break.
Yes.
So it's all of this is a big compromise.
So it then comes down to the balancing act, doesn't it? You know, you want to retain the qualities that you're getting here, that overall sort of dark sound, but at the same time, it needs to flow over those moments, those sticking moments, like the break point.
Yeah, exactly.
And then a lot of it comes down to the control as a player. You know, you've studied, you've done so many break exercises, probably. From the C sharp to the D to try and disguise those natural idiosyncrasies within the instrument. But perhaps actually we can then just demonstrate maybe the same piece, but with a different mouthpiece of your choice that would change the game in those little areas you mentioned.
Yeah, of course.
Great.
Nice.
Giving you some space at the end there to let the music breathe. Sounding good. So what are your feelings then playing from the Selma onto, actually we should say, what is this?
This is my own mouthpiece.
Yes.
This is completely crazy. This is an Eisen TSSO, their soloist style mouthpiece, in a 7-star opening, which arguably I think is a little bit too wide the other way. But
the big part of the video, it just goes to show you can play on and sound fantastic there. You know, you really didn't sound a whole load different, I have to say, just from the listening point of view. And I think this is an important topic. The idea that you just sound like yourself, Aiden, with a nice contained classical sound, while playing on something that's quite contrasting to the first mouthpiece, the Selma, but you managed to contain it in a way such that you still put the solo out there in the same way, but it just gave you a different experience, I'd imagine, as a player, controlling the sound in a different way.
Yeah, I think the big thing with when you go to a wider tip opening is definitely you want to go for a softer reed, a slightly more responsive reed.
Sure.
So on this one, I think I've got actually a select jazz in a 2 hard, which can be a bit bright. So you have to temper the high frequencies a little bit. So that top E flat, if you're not careful, can be a bit wild. But I think it pays dividends in the sort of the warmth that you get in the rest of the register, and that the low end still has a little bit of cut to it, and it doesn't, you know, if you imagine you're playing this in a concert hall, playing, you know, down to a low D on a tenor saxophone as a soloist in a concert hall can feel very like, whoa, very sort of round
big.
And not very direct. And, you know, you can lose the ends of the notes and stuff like that. And having a little bit of brightness, I think, is really helpful.
Sure. That makes sense. Perfect sense, yeah. And I could really hear it actually just next to you there. It had, there was almost a very slight openness to the sound down below, that jazzy element, but it was still nice and covered. So it was a nice balance of all of those elements that you're talking about.
I think a lot of tenor players eventually settle on something slightly wider than the SATC stars and stuff. And I think,
well, that cues very nicely what we were talking about a week ago when we had this idea to do this video, which is, so this is coming from the point of view of someone who doesn't know so much about classical tenor playing. I've always found that whenever I've tried the classical tenor setups, I go for the equivalent tip openings, for example, as to that of the alto, so C stars. Yeah. And I really struggle just getting any air through the thing. And I don't know if it's to do with the way the manufacturers configure the tip openings. I mean, in theory, a C star on a C star SAT tenor should be wider than that of an alto.
Yes,
and it is, but somehow it just feels narrower, and I just feel like I can't get enough air through it and control those bottom notes. For example, like a really irky note when you're playing full tone on the tenor, not subtone, would be in a G, F area. Yeah. And if it's really narrowed down there, I find it really, not that as I keep repeating, I'm not an expert on the classical tenor playing, but I really think, how can even a qualified player really open the sound out down there with this tip opening? And that's where I wonder whether it's just all a bit wrong and we need to be thinking in terms of a wider tip opening in order to open that area.
I think I'm inclined to agree in that, slightly wider tip opening and a slightly softer reed as well is really, it's tricky because on alto and soprano, we spend a lot of time trying to make everything as consistent as possible. There's obviously different trains of thoughts on how best to play, but generally people want something where you can, play in the low register, press the octave key, and without too much of a change, it goes up the octave, that sort of thing. And so we tend to find classical players on alto and soprano go for the C star, or equivalent, it might be an S90, 180. The occasional player has a soloist. But generally narrow tip openings and a harder reed. And I think that approach just doesn't work with tenor. It becomes very covered, particularly, I could show you in some of the Vaughan Williams.
Let's do it.
In a moment. There's a bit where you're forte, and you're playing a little bit in the sort of middle high register, and then you have to go down from a C natural under the break to a low E and do a staccato run down up from the low E, and And if you don't have a setup that's free blowing, and if you don't drop the jaw enough, that just jumps up the octave.
I can imagine.
I think with a narrow tip opening and a hard reed, it's hard to reach that level of slight relaxation beyond what we do with alto and soprano.
But maybe with the alto, with the smaller tube, you can kind of get away with having the flexibility in that area.
I think it's generally a bit more forgiving
through.
there. Yeah, yeah.
That makes perfect sense.
Well, how about I play that now?
Let's
I'll show
do
you
it.
what I'm on about.
Let's do it. Yeah.
Yes.
I love that fortissimo bit in the middle.
Yeah, it's great.
It's almost like the relief after the really tricky stuff just before it.
Yes.
By the way, I'm pointing to his music over there.
Yeah, it is over
there. He's got his music set about 2 meters in this direction. You can barely read it, but I think you sort of somehow know it internally anyway, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's really challenging.
It is.
Let's just say that before we talk about the gear and stuff.
is.
That is a challenging little excerpt there.
Yeah.
But I think you made the point nicely before. I mean, the bit where you go, was it C down to the E?
Yeah,
So,
there's a C down to the E that's just really...
do you want to just play that little bit?
It has a real tendency to want to go...
Yes.
If your voicing isn't right, and I find with a narrow tip opening, that, for me, it accentuates that sort of desire to want to keep the embouchure tight, and it
and then it
jumps
could
up.
splutter up the octave,
Exactly,
which
yeah.
it didn't do there.
Yeah.
And kind of solve that in a way by putting on that mouthpiece, which is the soloist D.
It's Selma Soloist D, which is just a smidge wider than the C star, and I find it just responds that bit better, particularly when you're having to do staccato stuff in the lower register. And again, a caveat with all of this is that I have spent some time this morning playing all of these and making sure they've got a good reed that matches them.
Absolutely, we've not spoken about the reeds, well, not too much anyway, but that changes everything, doesn't it? You know, you get the wrong reed on, it doesn't matter. If you've got the wrong reed, the whole thing's out the window.
The whole thing's a waste, yeah.
So you tried to find some reeds that matched up to the different mouthpieces that we've got here.
Yes, yeah. Generally, where everything is either a Van Doren traditional in a 2.5, reserve, D'Addario reserve in a 2.5, or a select jazz in a 2 hard. I think this is a reserve in a 2.5.
Right.
So, all of them are within that category of relatively soft.
Okay.
And the big difference between the jazz cut and the classical cut is that a jazz cut is a bit more, the very tip vibrates a lot more. It's a bit more responsive than the classical
So you're going to hear more of the highs, particularly maybe as you go higher in the range.
Yeah,
you're going to hear
tend to find
sizzling away.
Sizzling, exactly, is the term I would use. Yeah.
It's great actually to sort of have this out here that you can use that, the select jazz reeds, and have them playing in this context, working absolutely fine, because it's all about pairings again, isn't it? You get the right reed, the right mouthpiece. In this example, this sounds great, and it just works.
Yeah.
And if you play with the right approach, which, if you were to give me the saxophone right now with my embouchure and way of playing, the sound would actually be completely different, which is, so much of it, isn't it? It's about the player and the way you tune the sound, the way you've trained, the way you think about the sound.
Yeah.
After years of working towards that, that end goal.
And as we mentioned earlier, I was reading, it's very sad, but I was reading some research about tenor saxophone pedagogy or pedagogy?
Yeah, pedagogy, I think.
And interesting, I think it's a quote from Kyle Horch that was in this paper. It might be misattributed, but he says something along the lines of the tenor is something that people in classical settings only ever play under duress, where it's very much the case you're booked for something and it's like, oh, you're doing tenor in this, by the way, and then people are like, oh gosh, scramble to find a mouthpiece that works, and most people just think, oh, I play a C star on alto, and then they rush into that, and I just think there are other options that are worth talking about,
as we are proving right
here. Yeah. I think maybe before we get too carried away with all of that, maybe I'll play you a link
Let's
hear a link.
Let's hear a link playing. And what are you going to play?
I'm going to play a very short excerpt. It's just a tenor solo from the start of, what's it called? Eugene Botz's Andante and Scherzo.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's the tenor solo from the start of Andante and Scherzo, which is a saxophone quartet piece.
Right.
And it's really lyrical, really beautiful. And hopefully you can hear that even on this, which is going to be a hard rubber link in a 6-star, very much a jazz mouthpiece. If you temper it by spending the time with the instrument, you can actually get away with a slightly jazzy mouthpiece. Definitely.
I think I believe you. And
You think
now
so?
I want to hear it.
Yeah, the tenor saxophone player in my own quartet plays on a link
Right.
in a 5, I think. This could be a tad sharp because it's quite loose on my neck cork.
Nice. Very beautiful.
Yes.
There's a nice airy, floaty quality to the sound.
Yes, yeah.
And we have got an Otto link.
It's an Otto link in a 6.
6 here.
So, which a lot of people would sort of totally disregard. But I think the 6 is probably too wide. I think I would prefer a 5. But right now we haven't got one in. But it just goes to show that even, that solo tenor saxophone is totally unaccompanied. And then it sort of needs to be quite a warm sound. It spans sort of the main range of the instrument, doesn't go too high. You land on A sharp, B flat.
Yeah.
But then you've got the soprano comes in, then the major third above that. So it's, you've got to be able to blend at the end of that, you've got to be in tune. And even though I don't think that setup is perfect for me, it goes to show you the flexibility that the tenor has on any given mouthpiece. Obviously, you don't want a high baffle, but something like a slightly wider tip opening with a low baffle isn't something to be ignored.
That's right. We're moving into the realm of the jazz mouthpiece here.
Yeah.
Tone Edge Otto link. Sorry, it's not the Tone Edge. It's the.
Is that a vintage?
It's the vintage. Yeah.
The vintage Tone Edge.
But I think it's the same idea. The same thing applies that you could play it on the Tone Edge. It's the idea. It's a jazz-based mouthpiece. As you say, you don't want the high baffle. You start moving into a different territory altogether there.
Exactly.
But we're not just limiting ourselves here to your S90s, S80s, Van Doren, TL5s, and what have you. That sat here again a couple of feet away from you, I'm hearing some slightly different sounds every time. It's almost like it's the same sound. It's still you, but I'm just hearing just like a different cover on the sound, just a different colour, really. With that one, to me, it sounded like there was an airiness that was coming through, just a nice floaty airiness. And I think you get that with links, where you get that
is a link
airiness.
Quality, yeah.
This is a link thing. It's almost like it's not great at being aerodynamically efficient. If you take like I always use that phrase for Jody pieces, where it takes all of the air and transforms it into a really pure sound. With the link, part of the beauty of it is that you get that airiness, which I think is part of the beauty of the character of the sound of a link.
Yeah.
And it works great in jazz context. But here, playing that really beautiful straight melody, it had a really dreamy kind of sound to it. And that the link for me worked really well in that context. So we've heard you playing on now 4 different setups altogether, and playing 4 pieces of repertoire, I think, and all slightly different and all different setups, but all pointing towards a great result, which is that they are all working for you in just slightly different ways. So it's a nice way to make the point that really what we're trying to say is, let's just break the boundaries a little bit here. We don't have to necessarily go down that route of it has to be an S80 C star. That did work very nicely at the beginning, but we've also proved that many other setups can work equally well. And perhaps you might want to just rattle off a list of mouthpieces and setups that can work overall for this general style of playing.
So I think obviously you've got the obvious ones, which people will probably find recommended a lot, will be things like your Selmer S80 C star, Selmer Soloist in a C star, the Selmer S90, maybe a 180, things like the Van Doren T20, which is quite nice actually. That has got a bit more brightness to what you might expect from it. And then like the Van Doren Optimum series, particularly the TL3 and TL4 are very popular. I would say, just to add, and this is just about, having the courage to just try things and see how they work for you, because if you're going to come on down here to try classical tenor mouthpieces, you might as well throw in some oddballs and, see if anything different will work for you. So the other things that I think notable mentions are the Eisen Soloist, which I'm a really big fan of. In a 6-star, I think is a lovely mouthpiece. It will be wider and brighter than you're used to, but if you can tame that, they're really fabulous things. And then, something like an Otto Link in a 5 is very nice. And, maybe even something like a Jody Jazz HR Star in the narrowest tip opening you can find might also be worth a go.
Maybe even the Custom Dark. I don't know if you've had experience on those.
Actually, I don't think I've played one in a classical setting, but they're very nice as well.
Shout out to Jody there. I can see him saying that back in America. So let's add that to the list.
Yes.
That's really fabulous. It really does go to show that it's not a closed book when it comes to tenor saxophone setups. The same can apply to other instruments as well, the alto and the soprano. But we wanted to home in on the tenor, didn't we, today? Because it does get left a little bit behind.
Yes.
There's not so much repertoire for it, and people tend to become more the specialist on the alto, like you were saying earlier, and the soprano, and then the tenor is the sort of, the sad instrument left in the corner. But it can sound so great, as you have demonstrated here, with multiple different setups.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Well, I think that just leaves us to say that we have all of these setups here at Sax. And as Aiden's saying, we encourage you to come down and try them for yourself, because ultimately it's very subjective. Don't be closed off into thinking it must just be this one particular mouthpiece setup because my teacher told me to play on it. You must be open to different things, because you can get wonderful results when you open your mind. So please come on down, and we shall see you in the store soon, hopefully trying these fantastic mouthpiece setups.